Now, this is the story that is going to mark the time of Boris Johnson in post at number 10 Downing Street as the incumbent Prime Minister. It may sound comparatively less important than many of the other issues. This is the Sun owned by Rupert Murdoch, and the title that we often call the scum. But this piece, editorial, the fourth and the last piece in the editorial column, is rare. And I shall spell out why it is rare. It says, Environment Secretary George Eustice's obstinacy in refusing a stay of execution for Geronimo, the alpaca, looks bovine. If Geronimo does have tuberculosis, which now looks dubious, what possible reason is there not to give him a new test before carrying out the death sentence? And the last line and the last paragraph is absolutely telling. Or does Mr. Eustace not trust the test? Because it is on the alleged strength of the test that Geronimo allegedly tested positive, on which Eustace and Johnson are determined to murder this Geronimo. Now, we should, just to put the emphasis on the words and we're just putting it closest to the camera as possible, as close to the camera as possible. Now, this man is being described, Stanley Johnson, as the Sun wildlife reporter. Well, Geronimo is not wildlife, but it is very much to do with environment. And the piece by Alex West accompanying the piece by Stanley Johnson are both factual. And what they're saying is that the Geronimo has been sentenced to murder in order to avoid liabilities that the government owes for other government's own errors. Okay, I'll go into the details of the errors and the wrongs in some detail here. This is part B. The part A had a few minutes at the end of the tape or the video that were impacted by some kind of unexpected disruption in the internet connection. So I'll make up for the possible loss of any content that might have happened in part A. This is part A of the KhoodeelaarTV television channel. And I repeat the assertion that this is the world exclusive original diagnosis of Fleet Street. That is, we diagnose not only the errors and lies and bias peddled by the newspapers every day, every edition, but we also examine the connections and the impact and the implications wherever possible. So we don't do that on every particular topic of the day, but we continue consistently to examine based on the evidence, examine the bias, the agenda, the connections, etc. Now, the Sun newspaper, for whatever reason, has been the only Fleet Street paper that is doing any kind of substantial reporting about the facts surrounding the murder plot against Geronimo. And there are these key facts that I'm going to outline and shortly, briefly describe. Geronimo is a perfectly healthy alpaca that belongs to this very experienced woman, Helen MacDonald. Helen MacDonald is a trained veterinary nurse. So she is very much in the field. She is very much entitled, based on her experience of decades with animals, looking after animals, caring for animals, and understanding animals, she's entitled to be treated as a serious expert, as a considerable expert with considerable significant knowledge of animal biology, animal health, and animal lives. Secondly, she's a farmer. She has other animals, and she has done that for a long time. And she lives in the county of Gloucester, where there is a farm, and she has got the farm. And Geronimo lives with her and the other animals with the necessary specific and safety-linked distance from the other animals. She is what I would call, from all the descriptions that I have come across, she is not a party political activist. And she is not somebody that is embarked on any political activities challenging the government or anything. She may be, with a small c, a conservative, but she is not engaged, as I said, in any anti-government or anti-social activities. And the concern that every conscientious person must have about the treatment that Boris Johnson fronted government, and before that the Theresa May fronted government has meted out, that is dished out to Helen MacDonald, includes the fact that if somebody as ordinarily describable as a decent, law-abiding, sensible, rational person like Helen MacDonald can be treated in that way, then most people in the many would not stand a chance of any decent behavior, any fair behavior by the government. And in her efforts, in her own original ways, to save Geronimo from murder, over the last 4 years. Helen MacDonald has been the victim of a series of serial, illegal, malicious attacks by the government. As she says to the Sun, and as is contained in the Stanley Johnson piece today, she feels that she has been punished. She is being punished. Why would somebody who would be a model citizen, a model neighbor, a model friend, model acquaintance, the way she has been treated because of her love for the animal and for her love for the animal, which is innocent. I mean, all the treatment that she has been kind of subject to are illegal treatment for which Boris Johnson and the government can be prosecuted. And I'll spell out why. As anyone watching this program would know, we often refer to the United Kingdom's treaty obligations. Treaty meaning international conventions, international agreements, and international declarations that the United Kingdom, as a member of the international community, has signed and has to sign from time to time. And most of those treaties, most of them, not all of them, most of those treaties and declarations and conventions place specified, clearly expressed obligations and duties on the given signatory state. That is to say, the state like the United Kingdom. I mean, one of the things that became very central in the claim by the Brexiteers as a strong argument for their claim to leave the European Union was that staying within the European Union meant that the UK didn't have freedom to pass its own laws. Now that is an example, but that's a comprehensive example. It's an example of treaty obligations. And the departure of the UK via Brexit was about the treaties, about the agreements, about the declarations, and about the directives, let's say. Of course, the European Union had directives, various directives, the various stages of the sophisticated form of treaties and agreements. And one of the other, not Brexit related, but very much similar to Brexit, treaty obligations that the United Kingdom has been under arise from the human rights conventions that used to be abbreviated for many years as ECHR. And the European Convention on Human Rights, not part of the European Union membership, but very much Europe-wide, similar to in terms of the range of applications. And those were partly translated as part of the obligations by the UK passing the Human Rights Act, 1998, I think. And the majority of the European Human Rights Convention that are replicated or supposedly replicated in the Human Rights Act are about the human rights of people like Helen. And the substantive majority of the obligations on the UK state in relation to Helen MacDonald have been violated. And Helen MacDonald is entitled to spend another 10 years or whatever in pursuing the UK government for violating her convention rights and the Human Rights Act rights. One of the reasons why people who support Brexit have also been supporting the demand for scrapping the Human Rights Act. You can see the reason. Because the Human Rights Act, even although it's not a complete replication of the convention, the European Convention, on which it is modeled and has had to be modeled, still upholds the rights of an individual within the UK against the UK state and its apparatus. The kind of obligations that the likes of George Eustace and Boris Johnson and even Theresa May would be and are very hostile to. Why? Because those obligations contradict, challenge the dark age mentality that Boris Johnson and Eustace have been embarked on in trying to murder Geronimo. So quite apart from the clinical flaws, very serious clinical flaws that DEFRA has against in its plot to murder Geronimo, there are a huge number of legal obligations that the United Kingdom will remain obliged to Helen for the rest of her life and forever. Even if the United Kingdom, being dragged by the dark ages of the reactionary fascist kind of regime into undermining the existing Human Rights Act 1998, it will not deprive Helen of the rights and the claims that she has had and does have against Eustace and Johnson et al., that is others in the government. And she has claims against the judiciary, the Lord Chancellor. Because the Lord Chancellor, who is the kind of head of the, quote, legal department or the judiciary department, has been, and his department has been, under clear obligations to uphold the Human Rights Act, because it's a UK Act, also the Convention, and going back to 1948, the founding declarations of the United Nations itself, which contains, or which do contain, many of the rights that Helen is entitled to and has been entitled to as part of her responsibilities and her relationship with Geronimo. Her personal rights, her human rights, and all the other things. Now, the references I'm making can be checked. I mean, all this stuff is accessible. The Human Rights Act, the founding declarations of the United Nations, and various jurisprudence from the European kind of convention area. So, the coverage by The Guardian, for example, say, has been a cover-up for the crooks and the liars and the deniers in the DEFRA and in Boris Johnson's own inner cabal. The Guardian is, corrupt to the core. It doesn't have a reporter assigned to it. We'll check again for update on the state of The Guardian about Geronimo, but the latest one, I mean, they have parked it, they have sidelined, they have actually moved the responsibility of journalism from them to the press association by giving the credit to PA media, the morons. And that shows the corruption of Catherine Weiner, or whatever the vein. This woman is a corrupt one. Anyone watching this program about the Guardian's corrupt criminal role in covering up the bogus trial for housing fraud, staged featuring one of the two Tower Hamlets Bara MPs, Afsana Begum, would remember that we record in denouncing the Guardian's lying and covering up. We denounce the Guardian's history of covering up for the corrupt regime, the corrupt, criminal, crooked, lying, unfit, dishonest regime of the elected mayor ousted from office by the election commissioner Richard Morey on 23rd of April 2015. That is Lutfur Rahman. Lutfur Rahman was given extra space by the corrupt Guardian. And there was a kind of exchange of corruption and corrupt favors by Lutfur Rahman and the Guardian. Guardian at that time mostly was, quote, edited by the crook Alan Rabisha. Rabisha is the name that the crook is given by Private Eye. I don't know exactly which one of the Private Eye personalities actually thought up the name Alan Rabisha. But Rabisha is a crook. Rabisha's wife or partner, whatever, Lindsay McKee, I met in the 1970s. So I know these people, and I also have followed, if you like, in a suffering way, let's say, but for the purpose, exactly for the purpose of evidence, fact-checking, and factual analysis. Everything that Rabisha writes, everything that Alan Rabisha has written, everything that can be ascribed to him, that is to say, that can be traced to him as the writer or author. I cannot say anything about items that I cannot link to him, but I can only say whatever I can say about him based on the published trace and link. So I've linked. And what Alan Rabisha does is kind of deflect and divert. And that has been the main role of The Guardian as a newspaper. And The Guardian is a racist paper. It was more racist with Peter Preston, who was the longest serving occupant in the post after the previous longest serving one, since the paper moved to London. Originally, The Guardian was called the Manchester Guardian. And the Manchester Guardian moved to London and ceased to call itself the Manchester Guardian, dropped the Manchester. But it is still historically and otherwise very much linked with its Manchester origins. The Guardian is important as a reference because most of the people who are targeted by its marketing are persuaded to believe that the guardian is a objectively definable, neutral, non-partisan kind of paper, which description cannot be applied to the Sun or the Daily Mail or the daily bribing Boris Johnson graph, also known as the Telegraph, or the Times, or the Express, of course, or the Scar, the Daily Scar, because they are all conservative party couriers. Sometimes on serious issues like Brexit, they're brazenly, offensively, outrageously untruthful. And the Fleet Street Papers' role in keeping the UK majority, the population, untrusting or refusing to trust the Labour Party has been absolutely central. So instead of calling the Conservative Party the party, it is the collection of Fleet Street that has been the main party stopping the Labour Party from gaining power or staying in power with the ideals that actually challenge the conservative ideals. Now, having said all of that, come back to the role of the Sun today, which is running this heading. Stop this absurd, murderous errand. Save Geronimo. Exclusive. Prime Minister's dad backs condemned alpaca fight. Well, that is a coincidence because Stanley Johnson, being kind of described as the wildlife reporter for the Sun, let's say in good faith, we are treating this as a kind of coincidence. Whether it's coincidence or not, it doesn't matter whether he's employed by the Sun or he's just speaking out for the victim of the corrupt and criminal plot, murder plot by the regime fronted by Boris Johnson. Again, we are quite happy to treat this intervention as coincidental, that Stanley Johnson is genuinely concerned about this series of murderous errand that is contained and exhibited and exposed in the plot to murder this animal. And there are scientific reasons for opposing it. It's nothing to do with just emotional attachment. It's a fact that for years, this animal has been alive and bouncing. He's a joy to watch because Helen knows that he runs around and he enjoys himself. Any infected animal of his genre or his species would have died within weeks. It's not my opinion. It's not Stanley Johnson's opinion. It's the opinion and experience of people who live with animals like that. So whoever the High Court judge was, notice what I'm doing. I'm shifting stage by stage from one area of the state, UK state, that is breaking international laws, local laws, that is 1998 Human Rights Act, and also the 1998 Human Rights Act is not the only one. The Equalities Act is also a framework for auditing the government and exposing the government's discriminatory behavior against Helen. So, going back to the court, whatever the court, because in they keep referring to the High Court. They don't say which division of the High Court. And I have searched. Maybe I have not searched completely comprehensively, but my search is usually useful in producing results that are sought under the particular reference which I follow in carrying out the search in the first place. So my search has not so far produced any identification of the court, any identification of the judge or judges, and any description, let alone the details of any reasoning, any evidential reasoning for their, what I call, rubber stamping the murder plot. It's not a judicial action. It's a collusion, complicity with the murderers. So this decision by the court, whatever the court is, as I said, resembles the decision that the British papers and the British politicians condemn about Russia, about China, about other dictatorial regimes and states and countries. Notice what I'm saying. And what I'm saying, everything I'm saying is world exclusive, original diagnosis of Fleet Street. Now, the reason why the Sun piece, 2 pages, 8 and 9 today, that piece is significant on several levels. First of all, it is doing what a true journal should be doing. It's an issue that is happening. The issue is underway. So that is absolutely perfect timing and topicality. And the other one that it is doing is summarizing some of the key evidence of lying by Boris Johnson and his cabinet minister, George Eustice. Lying is not permitted in the law. So they are on this lying alone, they are liable to prosecution. Now, it is understandable why they are not. The Sun piece is not referring to the court case in any detail, but that could be a policy decision to avoid being seen as being overly critical of the government and overly being critical of the court system. Now they are deferring. Newspapers defer to the courts, and they defer to the ministers, and they defer to the regime, because the newspapers are, these newspapers, including the Times, is of course actually the main pillar, the main foundation on which the conservatives come into power and stay in power. As extensively admitted and revealed, if not admitted, but revealed, because I'm talking about dozens of, quote, witnesses during the Levison inquiry, especially the examination of witnesses like Rebecca Brooks, who is Rupert Murdoch's de facto daughter, and David Cameron. Cameron is the one who actually appointed Brian Levison. Brian Levison is a Liverpool-born person of Jewish origins, and he was appointed to examine the role of the Murdoch newspapers, including the Sun, News of the World, in the context of the revelations that Millie Dowler, the victim of a murder and sex assault, her phone was abused and accessed by the hackers working with and working for the Murdoch newspapers, the News of the World and the Sun. So during the examination of David Cameron himself, and Rebecca Brooks, more than enough revelations came across about the relationships that existed between Cameron as the leader of the Conservatives and as the Prime Minister and the Sun newspaper and the Rupert Murdoch newspapers, let's say, to show what most thinking observers in society have claimed for a long time, that Murdoch was actually owning the Conservatives or owning the government of the day. In fact, Murdoch openly became identified as the source of public support for, within quotes, Labour Party as led by Tony Blair. Tony-B. Liar. That's our name for Tony Blair because he's a liar. And enough evidence came across about the very serious, very close contacts between Rebecca Brooks and Tony Blair, Rebecca Brooks, and David Sleazeball Cameron, and contacts even with Gordon Brown, who later staged a series of kind of intentionally devised denunciations of the Murdoch newspapers. The fact is that the Murdoch newspapers, identified as the Sun and the Rupert Murdoch owned News of the Screws, as Private Eye called it, played unique power roles in actually putting into government any party. And these were only two parties. One is the Conservatives, and the other is the Blair-fronted, Blair-fronted, quote, Labour Party. So this piece in the scum, usually we call it the scum, is a departure because it is actually not supporting the fascist, the criminal behavior of Boris Johnson and George Eustice. And the headline and the subheading and the main copy ascribed to Stanley Johnson, they're all consistent with the evidence. They don't go all the way about the role of the court, as I was saying at the beginning of this segment or this part, because they don't want to upset the court bureaucracy. They don't mind condemning the courts otherwise, but on this occasion, they're holding back. And the reason for our focus on the court's bureaucracy is this. Remember what I said about the international obligations and the Human Rights Act, and the Brexiteers claim that the human rights is impairing, deterring the UK from passing and controlling its own laws. That itself is a complete, absolute untruth. Because when they did the Brexit propaganda, all the propagandists for Brexit, or the kind of promoters of the argument for Brexit, said similarly untruthful things. Even the key propeller of this strategy for Brexit, the man involved with the boat leave, Dominic Cummings, widely kind of considered as being the leader of Boris Johnson's politics in that phase, within the frame of Brexit, let's say, even if not. in terms of Boris Johnson pursuing a political career, because there has been hardly any public references to Dominic Cummings being involved in Boris Johnson's career when Boris Johnson, embarked on a career in Parliament, or indeed Boris Johnson's kind of ambitions and strategies to get hold of the corrupt post of corrupt mayor at the expense of the people of London. Remember, Boris Johnson only became a candidate after the otherwise unexpected kind of exposure of Jeffrey Archer. Jeffrey Archer became exposed as the liar who had lied about his contact with a prostitute. According to the revelations by a later disgraced person who was himself a user of a prostitute that Jeffrey Archer knew or was almost familiar with. So when Jeffrey Archer became exposed and he was sentenced to prison, that created for Boris Johnson a very unexpected opening to stand as the candidate for the Conservatives for the corrupt post of elected mayor at the expense of London. You'll notice that long description that I always attach to referring to the elected mayor as the corrupt mayor, the corrupt post holder. And I say at the expense of the people of London, because I don't believe that post is straightforward for the democratic benefit of the people of London, the voters of London. And I repeat the same about the corrupt elected mayor post in Tower Hamlets at the expense of the people of Tower Hamlets, and the corrupt elected mayor post in Newham at the expense of the people of Newham, or the corrupt elected mayor post of Hackney at the expense of the people of Hackney, or the corrupt elected post of Lewisham in London, south of the River Thames, at the expense of the people of Lewisham. Why? Because these are corrupt contortions, corruptly conceived in order to sideline, avoid, suppress, deny, and sabotage whatever limited democracy exists or existed in the local areas. And in Tower Hamlets, in the case of Tower Hamlets, of course, the elected mayor post was disgraced by Lutfur Rahman over the period 2010, October 2010, until the 23rd of April 2015, when he was officially kicked out of that post by the relevant election commissioner, a man called Richard Morey, who is a licensed law trader called Richard Morey, who also sometimes sits as a High Court judge. But on the occasion that he ousted Lutfur Rahman from the post of elected mayor at the expense of Tower Hamlets, Richard Morey was not sitting as a High Court judge. He was sitting as a what is called election commissioner. So the judiciary, whoever decided to rubber stamp George Eustace and Boris Johnson's kind of murder plot against Geronimo was not behaving as a proper judge, complying with the requirements of due process. And I'll explain in brief what the requirements of due process include. They have to be fair. They have to be fair, and they have to be based on fact and evidence. And they have to be derived from the precedents, universal kind of rules and expectations. And they have to be consistent with the rights of the person who is going to be impacted on by the ruling. And the process of the kind of hearing has to be in accordance with due process, the requirements of due process. Now, any definition of due process would require the judge or the judges, as I said, at this stage, I don't know whether there was a single judge involved or a panel of judges. But whatever the number, they had to be addressing reality, not a fantasy. That is to say, if the evidence is that Geronimo tested negative before he left New Zealand, then this has to be examined by applying the criteria of all the requirements of tests. And the fact that a series of unusual interferences were carried out on the body of Geronimo must be examined thoroughly. Now, there is no evidence that the judge has done that. And that is before we arrive at the point that for the last 4 years, DEFRA has refused. DEFRA has refused to allow. DEFRA has refused to allow new examination on the state of health, on Geronimo's state of health. Why? This must be the most important question. If DEFRA is basing its decision to murder Geronimo on a supposed test years ago, why not make them account for the claim that they don't want to allow another test whose result is the one that Helen has been comprehensively challenging and denying? The so-called previous test or tests. What are they afraid of? As the Sun editorial says today, doesn't Eustace trust tests? That gives the game away. That they don't trust it because they know that they may get exposed by Geronimo testing negative. Why? Because there are evidence. For 4 years, Geronimo has been running around, bouncing around as a healthy boy. No sign of any weakness, any illness in him. that is obvious before the formal procedural test. So the DEFRA cannot risk being exposed as scientifically a laughingstock and criminals plotting to hide their incompetence and their dishonesty by carrying out the murder of this healthy boy. How is it that a high court didn't see the need for any of this? It's worse than a rubber stamp, and that shows that the judiciary in England is corrupt to the core, unfit for purpose, and dysfunctional. And that is before we even consider the lack of access to the court system. The lack of access that is operated against the many. Millions and millions and millions of people cannot get to the court system because of the inaccessibility, the costs and the complications and the unreliability and the dishonesty of the courts. Unfitness on the part of the courts. The number of flaws that Stanley Johnson piece lists in the piece published today by The Sun, and I include both the print version and the online version in case there has been any changes in that contents since the print version was put to bed, that is to say, finalized. There may have been changes. The judicial system in this country, the judiciary, the High Court, the Supreme Court, whatever, what are they? They are not from the outer space. Outer space meaning that they are not from an innocent kind of origin. They are part of the population in this country. Anyone with experience of the mentality, the faculty, the intellect, and the abilities of people who are called to the bar, given license by the four inns of court, or the solicitors, soul cheaters, who are given counterpart licenses by the solicitors regulation authority. Anyone who has got actual experience and encounters with these people would know that they are like any other person. They cannot have higher IQs or higher ethical kind of standards or moral standards only because they have got a piece of paper saying that they are a licensed person to practice as a barrister or as a solicitor or as a legal executive. Most persons who are appointed still now to sit as judges at any level are from the ranks of the ones that are called barristers. That doesn't show that they know society or fact or evidence any more than anybody else. In fact, the evidence is that they know laws and rules and facts and evidence compared to the ordinary people, less than most ordinary people. And of course, there is no requirement that anyone who is getting a license to practice as a barrister has to be moral, compassionate, caring, whatever. So there is no way that we can see what this particular judge or High Court judges were looking at. What were the reasons? And the published summaries of these reasons show that they were not looking for reasons. They were just rubber stamping. So we say that sack these judges. If they are rubber stamping a plot for murder, then of course they should be sacked and prosecuted and tried as criminals. Imagine that Geronimo was a child, human child, who was deaf and could not speak and could not articulate sentences in the way that humans articulate. And that this boy had been condemned to be murdered for something that didn't exist, a disease in that boy's body. And secondly, Helen, his mom, human mom, Geronimo's mom, has other animals. And for 4 years, none of the other animals has been infected by Geronimo. 4 years. Not for a few minutes or few hours. If you extrapolate and if you apply the infection spreading phenomena of the process that has been identified with the spread of the COVID-19, it would only take place within hours. And Geronimo has, within the space defined, as I said, coexisted with the other animals or counterpart, or vice versa. The other animals have co-lived and co-inhabited the farm space concerned for 4 years plus. And none of the others has been infected by Geronimo. So what are they talking about? Why do they want to murder this boy? So extrapolate the principle, or the principle based on the unprincipled behavior of Eustace and Boris Johnson, and the mechanism of Johnson's spokespersons issuing rubber stamping stupidities, and apply those to all the other issues and policies that affect the lives and livelihoods of people affected by the decisions of the government and the government departments. What would happen? Most decisions that are wrongly made, unscientific, untruthful, as policies of murdering somebody for the sake of it, they wouldn't have any recourse. All the victims of all those decisions, denying asylum by the Home Office, and so on, denying benefits that people in severe states of disability and illnesses need to live. They won't have any justice. They won't have any kind of say against these unjust, murderous decisions. What does it mean by unjust and murderous decisions in relation to benefits? It's the department known as DWP, and we describe it as deprivation, want, and poverty creation department, DWP. Now, the current, quote, leader in place in the name of the Labour Party in the UK is Keir Starmer. Now, Starmer is linked with the Labour Party, isn't he? But in fact, Starmer lacks compassion, and Starmer has not come into the news space with any position for justice for Geronimo. Is that exceptional? Is that because Starmer is busy with something more important in terms of the application of justice and the behavior of accountability by the government that affects the life of somebody like Geronimo. Now, Starmer, by definition, is a conservative. And he, not a conservative officially a conservative, but he, despite being officially not a conservative at the time, issued a set of justifications or a set of justifying narrative statements that allowed the policy to murder claimants for benefits. Not long before he left the 5-year term as the DPP, that is Director of Public Prosecutions, at the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, Keir Starmer issued a number of regulations that he could issue by the fact of the post he held as the Director of Public Prosecutions. And those guidelines and the rules and the procedures raised the standard of verification required of the claimants seeking benefits. What that meant was that he made perfectly legitimate, genuine claimants seeking benefit, needing benefits, denied of those benefits because the standard of evidence and requirements that he introduced made it harder for the claims to be successful in time. What is the meaning of that? In time. That means that if the benefit is denied for too long, then the claimants may suffer irreparable emotional, mental stress and disorder, which is what happened. Before Starmer left, that is, during the period of the Conservatives' first few years, when Ian Duncan Smith, whom we call the Dracula Duncan Smith, was the Secretary of State, that is to say, cabinet minister at the Deprivation, Want and Poverty Creation Department, DWP, thousands of benefit claimants who were ill, severely unwell, were given the sanction, that is to say, were denied their benefits. And thousands of them committed suicide because they had no other source of income. So Keir Starmer, by making it even harder for such benefit claimants, was making sure that more vulnerable people in need, were pushed to commit suicide than had been the case before. So that is not only absence of compassion, kindness, that is cruelty of the type that can be only found in the behavior of Nazis and fascists and dictators. Think about what facts I'm referring to. If you don't agree with the facts or the links I'm making, then by all means do contact only with the facts that show that what I'm saying is not factually true. I know that what I'm saying is absolutely factually true, but if you decide to say that I'm not stating the actually factually truthful position, then you are welcome to tell me how, on what facts. Just limit your communication to the evidence, the fact, not to anything else. Now, this is the KhoodeelaarTV television channel. This is part B of Monday, the 9th of August 2021. And we are devoting the next edition as well, and to the defense of Geronimo. And we shall be supporting Geronimo for as long as is necessary. So for this purpose, we shall for the time being end this edition, which would be probably just over 2 hours, but I may be wrong. It may be less than 2 hours, but we shall see.